From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lydia Polgreen, and this is Matter of Opinion, South Africa edition. That's right, I'm going rogue. So, over the past 10 days, I've been reporting from South Africa, which just had a big election. But that's not the only reason that South Africa's been in the news. We've also been talking about South Africa because of its advocacy for Palestinians. And I've been thinking a lot about the meaning of South Africa for the world 30 years after the end of apartheid. So we're trying something different today. Instead of chatting with my co-hosts, I've enlisted two other guests who've been a crucial part of my reporting. One of them is Will Shoki, who's in studio with me here in Cape Town. He's the editor-in-chief of one of my favorite magazines, one that has shaped a lot of my thinking. It's called Africa as a Country. Hi, Will.
Hi, Lydia.
And my editor, Max Strasser, is joining us from New York. He's going to be asking us lots and lots of questions. Hi, Max.
Hi, Lydia. Hi, Will.
All right, Max, I'm going to hand the baton over to you. Let's talk.
So one thing you didn't mention, Lydia, is that you had been in South Africa before, of course. You were the bureau chief for the New York Times from 2011 to 2014. And so this is your first time back on a reporting trip since then. And I'm really curious what your impressions are coming back after a decade to do reporting. What's changed?
Yeah, it turns out that the time that I spent in South Africa was a real hinge moment for the country. So I got here about, a significant amount of time after South Africa had been liberated. And there had been this euphoric period post-liberation after 1994 where the kind of political and economic conditions globally were actually incredibly favorable to South Africa. So it had been on this kind of rise and there was this, really optimistic story. But around the time that I arrived, and I swear this was just a coincidence, things had really started to take kind of a darker turn. Inequality has actually grown in South Africa over the past decade. And that growth has actually happened not just between black and white, which was always kind of a permanent feature of apartheid, but there's been growing inequality between black people, which I think has really kind of changed the politics of the country. So coming back 10 years later, it's really kind of extraordinary to see the decline, actually. Unemployment is now at, basically 33%. The government can't seem to keep the lights on. There's been rolling power cuts. Violent crime is a huge problem in many areas, especially where poor people live. At the same time, and this is, I guess, maybe my glass half full observation, South Africa continues to be a source of inspiration and real moral leadership. The global South, in some ways, the entire decolonized world looks to South Africa as a place that is a symbol of leadership and of liberation. So, trying to kind of take all of that in and come away with a coherent understanding of where South Africa is today has been really interesting.
Right. I'm excited to get into a lot more of those specifics. I'm curious, Will, you've been in South Africa for this period, right? And does Lydia's impression sort of track with your experience there over the last decade or so?
I think it does. It's quite amusing that the last time Lydia was here, South Africa was at a hinge point, and the next time she's here for a reporting trip, South Africa is also at a hinge point. So I'm wondering if the problem is Lydia. I'm only teasing.
Maybe she's just a good journalist.
I think she is. I think she can tell when the winds of change are blowing. But I think certainly the story of the last 15 years in South Africa has been one of decline and regression, but I think it's unclear as to whether or not that necessarily means further decline, or if this is perhaps maybe a kind of productive moment in South African history. And it's kind of both disconcerting, but I think also interesting to start to speculate about what might be in store for South Africans.
Right. So now we're talking about the election. We're going to find out how the ANC, the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's party, which has been in power since the end of apartheid, is faring. What's the top line? What have we learned from this election so far, Lydia?
Well, as we're recording this on Thursday, the trends seem pretty clear. There had been a lot of speculation going into the election. The big question was, would the ANC fall below the 50% mark and lose their majority in the parliament? And the trend lines seem really, really, really clear that they are going to be well below 50% and, in fact, could fall as low as 42%. And so, effectively what that means is that the ANC will will almost certainly come back into power and be the governing party, but it will have to do so in coalition. And there are a bunch of smaller parties that are going to be jockeying to exert influence and find a way to take power alongside of the ANC. The academic William Gumede had a column in the Sunday paper here in which he described the voters of the African National Congress as having a kind of trauma bond with the party, which felt very apt and apropos to me that, at the end of the day, there is this kind of emotional attachment to the party that ended apartheid and brought freedom and brought multiracial democracy to South Africa. And I think there was a part of me in all of my conversations that sort of sensed that a lot of voters were eventually going to come home to the ANC. And it doesn't seem like that's what's happening.
Will, if I can put you on the spot, did you vote in this election?
I did.
Can I ask you how you made your decision? I mean, maybe you want to talk about your trauma bond with the ANC. But really, I mean, I'm curious how you went into this as a voter.
I think it was a difficult election to enter into as a voter. I think this idea of trauma bonding with the ANC is apt. On the one hand, I think there's a real felt appreciation for the ANC across the political spectrum in South Africa, regardless of what your party lines might be. Maybe it's not something that South Africans will acknowledge all the time, but I think people can recognize the triumphant role it played in the liberation struggle. And certainly kind of for me as a voter, I think the advocate Tembeka Ngugaitobi put it really aptly, I thought, in an interview with the Financial Times when he spoke about the ANC's decline, but I think made the really compelling point about, which other political party prizes principles such as non-racialism, non-tribalism, these kind of universalist values, which I think defined movements of the ANC's type during the 20th century. But it's another question as to whether or not the ANC has lived up to them. So I think heading to this election was very difficult to make a vote because you don't really want to vote for the ANC. You don't want to vote for reactionary options. And the smaller parties that are out there, it's very hard to know whether or not they'll have enough traction behind them for your vote to make a dent in the political landscape. So it was very difficult to come to a decision.
Well, it's funny, Will, because I think another phenomenon that I picked up on was a lot of people just didn't vote.
Yep,
I mean, I
yep.
spoke to many, many young people, particularly the kind of so-called born-free generation, of which you are a member, people born after 1994, who just said, oh, no, I'm not registered or I'm not planning to vote. What is there to vote for? And that kind of apathy, I think, is quite worrying as well.
It's quite worrying, but I think it's also possibly maybe one reason to be hopeful, potentially. There were 27 million people registered to vote in these elections, but there were also 14 million unregistered voting age South Africans who felt like none of the options on the table spoke to them. And in a way, that's kind of a good thing because I think it's an indictment on party politics in South Africa. I think many of the options, if not all of the options, are fairly uninspiring. But it shows you that South Africans are ripe for an inspiring political alternative, and they might decide to become organized in some way and produce the alternative that might have a broader and larger resonance. So I think it all remains to be seen.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, I really like hearing that somewhat optimistic gloss on the loss of the ANC's majority because, as I've been reading a lot of Western press, American, British, European press about the South African election over the last couple of weeks, you see so frequently this discourse of broken promises, quote unquote, or like failed dreams or whatever. And it's interesting to hear your perspective on that and see something a little more positive or full of possibility there. I'm curious, how do South Africans view themselves at this moment? Are they talking about failed promises or broken dreams, or are they sort of saying, this is our country, this is where we're going?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear Will on this, but, my reporting was kind of a kaleidoscope of different perspectives. I get the sense that people deeply understand that this is a process, that building a democracy and building a new country, which is really what South Africa is, right? The country that was born in 1994 was a completely new country. And, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at, the amount of time that we're talking about here, which is just 30 years, that's actually just a kind of nanosecond in the political development of a country. I think the thing that's harder is that, there's been quite a specific experience of kind of downward mobility, particularly for those at the lower end of the economic spectrum. So just to give you one example, I mean, I met so many older people, people who were in their 40s and 50s, who had, pretty good jobs, often union jobs that were stable, that paid a decent wage, who had adult children who just couldn't find employment. And so the kind of traditional social role, which is for the older generation and for the younger generation to have a better life than the one before it, had been completely reversed. So, I spoke to a nurse who was in this situation. I spoke to a mine worker who was in this situation, who were sort of staring down their quote unquote golden years and thinking like, how am I going to take care of my children and grandchildren if I retire? And that sense of disappointment, I think, does come from having experienced that initial period of growth, of possibility, and also of delivery of government services. So I really do think that has had a profound impact on people's outlook. But it may not actually mean that they are giving up on or rejecting, politics per se. There's, people who can't find housing. They're just taking land and building informal settlements on it. And then they're organizing those settlements into these very kind of grassroots, sort of small d democratic committees that are cleaning up the environment, that are doing all these things. So there is, sort of outside of organized politics, there is, I think, a tremendous amount of grassroots energy that you're seeing that isn't really captured when you talk to people about what's happening in the overall political scene. So it's a real mix. I don't know, Will, what do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. What's interesting and also kind of difficult to make sense of is also the stark generational differences. Lydia dropped the term earlier, the born-free generation, who are people born after 1994. So these are South Africans with no experience or memory of apartheid. At least the memory of apartheid is mediated to them by their parents, by other family members, by social institutions. And so I think for this generation, the broken dreams, failed promises narrative both makes sense, but also kind of doesn't resonate because they came of age in a democratic South Africa. And so I think, the fallout of this election cycle, regardless of what the results are, would be interesting to sort of to suggest how South Africans understand the moment, which I think is one that feels like a different phase of our history, one that is kind of exiting this narrative that's framed by apartheid. Obviously, the legacy of apartheid is very much alive, and I think South Africans can pass that out eloquently. But it feels like we're entering something new that is distinctly post-apartheid, and I think understanding what the terms of engagement in that phase are, I don't think we know quite as yet.
I mean, there's something really interesting to me in that it's sort of making South Africa less exceptional in a way, right?
Yeah.
Because
Totally.
Look at elections in the United States or in Europe or all over the world where people are sort of feeling equally disappointed by what the state has been able to provide for them, where like younger generations are sort of like worried about economic precarity. Like that's a global story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's been interesting as an American to have South Africans be, honestly, quite a bit more concerned about our election in the United States than they are about their own. And, understandably so. I mean, when the United States sneezes, the entire world catches a very bad case of the flu. But it really does put that in perspective. And, Max, what you say about exceptionalism, I think, is really important. And you and I have talked about this in our conversations about my reporting here. Exceptionalism can feel like like a real boon when you're trying to get something really hard done. And that thing that needed to get done was ending apartheid. And in the kind of ordinary hurly-burly of moving forward and building a country and having a competitive democratic space, exceptionalism actually becomes a burden and it becomes an obstacle to moving forward. And I think some of what we're seeing in South Africa right now is, an abandonment of that exceptionalism narrative that, to me, actually offers up some real liberatory possibilities. If you're able to let go of the idea that you're so special, then maybe you can just kind of get on with it and build your society with the tools that you have at hand.
I think that is absolutely the hope. I think, we were talking about this earlier, Lydia, but I think there's a way in which South Africans are starting to realize that they're less exceptional. And this election feels like it's disabusing South Africans of that exceptionalism in significant part, because I think we now no longer present our democracy as this ironclad, robust institution that can withstand any challenge. I think South Africans, one thing that I think was quite striking, and we still don't quite know what the turnout numbers are, but it's very interesting to see a lot of South Africans voting with a sense of real kind of responsibility of, democracy and its institutions and its lifeblood isn't something that we can take for granted, is something that is fragile and could be jeopardized and disappear within a flash. And I think for me, that's kind of the beginning of the exceptionalism narrative breaking down, in the sense that I think South Africans are coming to appreciate that democracy is this thing that you have to tend to years after you formally enter into it.
I think that's all really, really interesting. And we're going to come back to these questions later of South Africa's democracy and democracy globally. But for now, let's take a quick break. And when we're back, we're going to dive into one of the issues that has played out in this election and also that has brought South Africa onto the world stage, which is the country's stance on Israel's war in Gaza. So we've focused on some of the internal challenges for South Africa in this election. But of course, the country has been on the world stage a lot recently, if you've been following the news, for a very different reason. South Africa has been a major player in the biggest international story of our day, which is the war in the Middle East, Israel's assault on Gaza. It was South Africa that brought genocide charges against Israel to the International Court of Justice. Lydia, can you fill us in, explain what's happened so far? What's the latest on those charges? What has South Africa done?
Sure, yeah. So in January, South Africa went to the International Court of Justice, which is, of course, the UN's highest court, and accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. And the court found that South Africa's case was at least in part plausible, and at that time had ordered Israel to take greater care and protect civilians in Gaza, allow in more aid, and so on. Then, as the Rafah incursion has begun, South Africa went back to the court, demanding that it halt the assault in Rafah in order to protect civilians. And this time, the court took an even stronger action, ruling that Israel must immediately halt the assault on Rafah. Now, of course, the court has no means of enforcing its ruling, but, it's been a huge moment on the global stage, and it really highlights the isolation of Israel, but also the isolation of the United States, which I think thinks of itself as the guardian of the international rules-based order and has really kind of found itself in a very awkward position vis-a-vis those rules and that order as this has played out in these courts.
Yeah. Will, I'm wondering if you can tell me a little more broadly, why do you think it was South Africa, of all the countries in the world, that took this case to the ICJ, to the International Court of Justice?
I think the big reason is that our experience of fighting against racial oppression is fairly recent. It's not so far gone in our memories, and it's a living heritage in South Africa. And I think even during the anti-apartheid struggle, there was a very strong affinity and closeness to the Palestinian liberation struggle, sort of in the years immediately after democracy, Nelson Mandela famously said that the freedom of South Africans is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. And so I think there's that kind of organic resonance that South Africans identify Palestinian liberation as forming part of a long-standing tradition of struggle against colonialism, against racism. And I think that having experienced that very recently, South Africans overwhelmingly feel responsibility to stand up where they see a similar experience unfolding internationally. But it's not something that they can do without consequences, whether diplomatic or economic or whatever the case might be. It's not as if South Africa is not like every other state in the world where it faces constraints in its foreign policy. But I think it reaching a point where it was prepared to take this, I think was also the product of South Africans themselves exerting pressure on the governments to do something.
I think one thing that skeptics or critics would say, though, is that there can be a little inconsistency or even hypocrisy to South Africa's foreign policy, right? That South Africa claims that it's standing up for oppressed people. But if you look at South Africa's position on the war in Ukraine, it's very much stood on the sidelines. It's very conscientiously said, we're not getting involved. We're not taking sides here. We're not going to stand up for the little guy in that conflict. How do you square that, Will? How do South Africans make sense of that?
I think it's a difficult thing to square. I mean, I do think it's an example of inconsistency on the part of the South African government. I think the South African government is still in its experimental phase with this role that it's trying to carve out for itself as, for lack of a better word, moral or normative superpower. And I think that there was just tremendous reluctance to quote unquote side with Ukraine, so to speak, because to do so felt as if it was to position oneself in alliance with the West and kind of participate in what I think a lot of people in the global South do experience as a proxy conflict that is being contested by two great powers at the expense of Ukrainians. And I think that's maybe the more non-aligned position. But I think it's just it's awkward. There's a lot of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend going on. But I think what Palestine has been an opportunity for the South African government to try and develop a much more sophisticated foreign policy, kind of trying to really fine-tune what it means to be non-aligned in this growing multipolar order. I don't think it's quite found the language yet to explain how it's been in relation to Israel-Palestine versus how it's been in relation to Ukraine. But I think it remains to be seen whether they can kind of square that circle, or maybe they might sort of account for that mistake in the past. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it's funny, Will, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, I find the accusation of hypocrisy to be one of the least serious and impressive accusations in the world, right? Because to be human is to be a hypocrite, right? We all sort of go against our principles and, do the needful in the moment and act as we need to, based on our current needs and situation, because, that's life. But I also think the ability to get away with hypocrisy is actually a measure of power.
And
I think that the United States, from the South African perspective, and again, I'm less talking about the government, but just the conversations that I've had with people in the Palestine movement here in South Africa, what they'll say is, why is the U.S. so able to condemn the bombing of hospitals, the killing of children in Ukraine, and unable to raise its voice in the same way in the case of Gaza? And so I think that in some ways, the ability to carry out a foreign policy that contains elements of what we might call hypocrisy is a measure of a certain kind of global ambition.
And to add to that, I think, part of the reluctance on the part of not only the South African government, but I think other governments in the global South to sort of fall in line behind the United States and the West behind rallying for Ukraine is the sense in which the West was saying, oh, we have to be concerned about human rights and sovereignty and so on and so forth. And I think the rest of the global South kind of stood up and said, oh, so now you care about those values? That's awfully convenient. So I think it kind of also reflected a desire to basically show the finger to the United
stick it to the man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which I think is, a legitimate expression because, as you say, I think there's, our hypocrisy doesn't have consequences for the balance of power in the world. It's just something to be annoyed about. But, when it's the case in the United States and the West, I think it's the feeling that, this actually does have consequences because you can influence how conflicts unfold. You can influence nation states and you choose only to do so when it serves your interests, not when it's in the interests of humanity.
We're verging dangerously close to anti-imperialism here.
Hurrah!
So as we're talking about South Africa's solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinians, and we're drawing some parallels between the experiences of Palestinians and the experience of South Africans under apartheid, that's a parallel that's drawn by South Africans and by Palestinians alike often. And as Palestinians take inspiration from the South African story, Lydia, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what you're thinking over the last few weeks about the messiness and challenges of liberation.
Yeah, I think, look, there's like a special and complicated relationship between South Africa, Israel, and Palestine. But one thing that a lot of South Africans have said to me about the limits of comparing the experiences of Palestinians to the experiences of Black South Africans is just the extent to which there was a tremendous amount of mixing because Black South Africans and colored South Africans and Indian South Africans were necessary as labor for the white regime. And so in some ways that created the possibilities of solidarity through trade unions and through other places where people came into contact with one another. So, there are definitely limits to sort of the comparisons between them and what we can learn. But, I've actually been very influenced by the work of a thinker named Mahmoud Mamdani, who wrote this great book in 2020 called Neither Settler Nor Native. He's a political theorist who teaches at Columbia University and has spent some time in South Africa. And he had this kind of beautiful idea that South Africa's transition was possible because of this extraordinary act of creativity and imagination in which the holders of what were seen as these, very, very fixed identities, settler and native, were able somehow to let go of what felt like these really fixed and opposed identities and mutually surrender them to a sense of shared survivorship of a kind of brutal colonial project and together to build something new. That sounds so kind of airy-fairy, pie-in-the-sky, could never happen. It's sort of hard to believe that it happened in South Africa. In this moment, it's almost impossible to imagine it happening in Israel and Palestine. But I do think that there are things about the story of how South Africa was able to get from there to here that feel sort of deeply, deeply relevant to what's unfolding.
It's such an interesting time to be in South Africa, precisely because I think maybe one thing that is up for debate now is whether survivorship is enough to sustain post-conflict political identity years after the conflict. Because I think you're kind of seeing that come undone and almost a return to those crude means of identifying people such as native and settler, just these questions of who authentically belongs in the polity. That's kind of coming up again. And I think it's for me, it's depressing to see because I do, for all its limitations, do believe in South Africa's liberation story. I do think there was something incredibly powerful about creating or reimagining political identity that was rooted in solidarity, even if it was an imperfect solidarity, even if it was something as simply as surviving the dehumanization of being oppressed and surviving the dehumanization of being an oppressor, and kind of saying, how can we imagine a country where both can coexist after being reinvented and sort of reconciling? But I think it's also normal for a country to reach this point where it's questioning whether the settlement it made at the end of a conflict was the right one, to question whether or not the political identities it reinvented are enduring enough. And we don't need to panic when that happens. I guess the thing that I'm wondering is be that as it may, what is the thing that kind of holds everything together once that Pandora's box is opened? Because it feels once the foundations of the post-apartheid nation state are being questioned, then the whole project in its entirety might be questioned. And is there going back after that? Are we going to something new? What might that something new be?
I want to talk more about whether we see some of the political trends in South Africa playing out similarly and echoing around the rest of the world. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. I want us to spend a little more time talking about the challenges of a young democracy like South Africa and looking at what lessons South Africa can apply to the rest of the world at a time when we're seeing a lot of democracies, young and not so young, being tested. This is a big election year for a lot of countries around the world, including the United States, Mexico, India, and South Africa, of course. Lydia, what have you been seeing that's unique to South Africa? And what do you see as similar to other democracies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Afrobarometer, which does these really great surveys on South Africa and other countries on the continent, found that 62% of South Africans are not satisfied with how democracy works in South Africa. And in 2011, again, the year that I moved here, that figure was 39%. So there's actually been a really significant jump in dissatisfaction with democracy. And I think we're seeing similar trends to that globally, and particularly in Africa and indeed in much of the kind of decolonized world. The other thing that I definitely am seeing here in South Africa is a real return of a kind of revanchist identity politics. You know, there are parties that are expressing a kind of ethnic nationalism that has been quite taboo, I think, in South Africa since the 1994 transition. This, of course, is a global trend, and there's no reason why you would think it would be happening any differently here. But you know, we see it playing out in another election that's happening like literally as we speak, that's wrapping up right now in India, where Hindu nationalism has been a really, really big force. At the same time, I think you're seeing a lot of the similar trends of economic populism here in South Africa, but it feels quite untethered from traditional class-based left politics, right? Which lets it link up quite easily to identity-based politics and the kind of politics of the belly in a way that I find quite worrying.
Will, some people are saying going into this election that South Africa's democracy is quote unquote in decline for some of the reasons Lydia just laid out. How do you assess that statement, the idea of democratic decline in South Africa? Is it fair to look at it that way?
I suppose I'd ask, what is the criteria to measure democratic decline? You know, is it decreasing voting participation? But I think there are other ways in which one could credibly say that South Africa's democracy is in decline. But I think it's also been a story of political demobilization, right? And the reasons for that are numerous. Major factors. One, as living and material conditions get worse, I think it just gets harder to motivate people to be politically active. And I think another is that I think a lot of South Africans are sort of at the moment kind of politically untethered. One thing, part of why I think the post-apartheid exceptionalism was a chimera is that it was, I don't want to say easy because I think that might sound a bit kind of crude and offensive, but it was much more straightforward to kind of rally South Africans against apartheid because the injustice was clear. The kind of antagonistic forces were clear, right? Whereas I think the political questions that, as we've been discussing today, that haunt South Africa now are much less straightforward. And I think South Africans are still feeling their way about how to discuss them, to debate them, who to rally behind. So I think that, democracy is in decline on the one hand for all of the reasons that Lydia had outlined. But I also think democracy, perhaps it's maybe more accurate to say that it's in an interregnal period where it's unclear whether genuinely it is in decline or it might have a resurgence, and maybe not even for the better.
Right. Well, we're talking about sort of time, and I want to ask a question about the younger generation, the so-called born-free generation, the people who are born and came of age after apartheid. How strong do you think their commitment is to democracy? Do they want democracy, or are they looking for something else entirely, a different model?
It's a complicated question to answer. I think they are committed to expanding our conception of democracy. I think the younger generation does not believe that democracy means voting in an election once every 4 years. I think they want to believe that it should mean something expansive. And I think the best expression of this is 2015, 2016, where the student protest rocked South African university campuses. Students were making demands for free education, for decolonized education, for the ending of outsourcing of campus workers to private companies. They should be hired by universities, a whole range of demands. And as a moment, it came and went. But I think its legacy is quite clear in the sense that you saw young South Africans articulating this idea that a kind of frustration with the idea that 1994 was this real turning point because South Africans had quote unquote democracy. And they said, well, democracy for who? Certainly it doesn't feel like democracy for me. It doesn't feel like democracy for millions of Black working class South Africans. So I think young South Africans want to push our understanding of democracy. How that will manifest, I'm not sure.
Well, and I think that, you can turn the question around and ask the political system, how are you being responsive to these demands that young people in this country are sending very, very clear signals of dissatisfaction. And the systems of political power, I think, need to figure out how to be responsive to and welcoming of those questions and demands, right? Because the way to harness that and the way to ensure the longevity and health of a democracy is to welcome those energies into the democratic process and allow them to have a seat at the table. Yeah. And that, to me, is the great task that needs to happen now. And I think it's really incumbent upon the political powers that be to make a case to those young people that they can come in and they can reshape the country's politics, because that's how you ensure the future of democracy. You can't be looking at young people and asking them, why don't you care about democracy? Well, make a space for them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lydia and Will. This was a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Max.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thanks for joining our intercontinental conversation. Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Derek Arthur. It is edited by Jordana Hochman. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Afim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker and Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.